us again with the time frame. But we're going to go in order that's on the schedule here. So Deepa can go first, and then 20 minutes, and then Teresita and Howard can go right after that. And the discussant, Steve, we'll have, what was it, 12 minutes?
12 minutes.
12 minutes. Okay, perfect. So, hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. Post lunch talks are always a little dangerous, but I hope that that bracing walk over here woke everybody up. If not that. Just a few points I want to make before I start. One is that the title of what you see is probably a little different from what I'm going to talk about, because I took John's original charge to heart and tried to do a more of a trilateralist approach, although not particularly in a triangular fashion or something, but I looked at both India's policies toward the U.S. as well as toward China to make some sense of that. Now, the other thing I want to mention is that I'm actually going to do something a little different. I'm going to, instead of presenting a paper, which is actually quite long, 9,000 words, I'm going to in fact start with my major conclusions and then work backwards. But I'm not confident that I'm going to stay within that 20 minutes if I actually do the whole paper. So let me just get my conclusions out. And when I do this, what I'd like to say is that I was very happy to hear the presentations this morning, because in fact they fit very well with, I think, what I'm going to be talking about. It gives me a great context for talking about my paper. You know, I'm not going to go too much into the realist and the liberal arguments, which I have in my paper because of the discussions we had today. Also, I think the third critique of April and John to Dale, which talks about expectations, trade expectations, I think actually you will see that that comes into my discussions, not quite as elegantly as what Dale has done, but in terms of trade expectations between India and China. The other thing to go back to the morning is what Jeff mentioned about, you know, to what extent are the spheres of strategic and economics distinct, and how do we bring that together? I think that really is a pretty big challenge. And so the way I have also structured my paper is to take an issue from one of each sector. So I hope that will bring up some interesting insights along the way. Okay, so the topic then is the India's policy towards the United States, but the bilateral and regional angles, to bring both that in. So let me just start with my kind of conclusions here. Let me just say one word about how I structured the paper, and that is that, you know, one of the things when you look at Indian foreign policy is to see that this more complex interdependence as well as the geopolitical context, what it has done is it clearly impinges on U.S. relations. And, but you get a kind of a puzzle in some sense, and that is India's economic interdependence is as strong or stronger with the mutual competitor of U.S. and India, China, but at the same time, it's a world where India's political relations are finely balanced to avoid tilting too strongly toward its so-called natural strategic partner, the United States. I mean, the U.S., so India is walking a rather fine balance here. And in many ways, the question that I'm trying to look at is, how can we understand what I would say is kind of under expectations in India's relations with the U.S. and over expectations in India's relations with China if we look at it from a kind of a geostrategic realist perspective. What I'm going to argue is that neither international realist theory nor economic interdependence theory is sufficient to explain this divergence in the outcomes. And instead, what I'm going to talk and bring in are some of the domestic factors that we talked about in the morning, particularly in the form of, I mean, I call it identity theory, but you know, it could be more loosely graphed along other sort of domestic political processes and so forth as well. But in essence, what I'm saying is that there has been a breakdown in foreign policy consensus in India over the last 15, 20 years, and so we have to bring that in now to understand what have now are becoming more contingent sort of foreign policy outcomes, all right? Okay, so in order to do that, I put forward two cases as a way of kind of loosely testing. It's not really a rigorous test, but in the sense that what I'm putting forward is the U.S. rebalance to Asia and India's reactions to that, which seems to be a good test case for the strategic approach. And then the India's economic relations with China, in particular, reactions to the trade deficit. Now, one could see that both of these cases are actually fairly strong. They strongly favor a realist predictions, okay? Because in the economic interdependence theory, one of the things that some economists, sort of neo-mercantilist type of thinking, would argue that trade deficit could actually be a arena of conflict. So we talked about that this morning as well. So, but I'm using both of these as cases to look at Indian foreign policy. So let me just quickly say what the findings are before I walk through the other the arguments. All right, so one, despite realism's, what I would call explanatory advantage on the rebalance and trade deficit, it fell short. Okay? Now, realism fell short most prominently on the rebalance, but was also weak on the trade deficit, to explain the trade deficit. Number three, and I have like 7 or 8 of these things. Economic interdependence seems to play a greater role in India's relations with China than one would conventionally see, even under what I call a hard case for interdependence, that is the duress of a trade deficit. Economic interdependence, that's a tough case for it. That's the one area where it may not actually work, so that's why I chose it. What you get is a kind of my argument is that India's underperformance vis-a-vis the United States and, say, overperformance vis-a-vis China cannot be explained just with realism or by interdependence. So as I said, Indian foreign policy is significantly shaped by identity factors, and among those identity factors, what I would flag as the most important is the value of autonomy in foreign policy. And I think in some other papers that on India, I saw that it's something that most of us recognize, but we have not really looked and tested it, just sort of assumed it in many ways. Now, another finding is that the autonomy value is more inconsistent in relations with the U.S. And it's stronger, and so what I would go so far as to say that it gives rise to a sort of identity gap between India and the United States, at least from the point of view of India. On the other side is an identity convergence of sorts between India and China, and I would say based on historical experiences, anti-colonialism, and that trauma, as well as current preferences for the global order, which tends toward more multipolarity than a bipolar. So in that sense, the India-China relations make it a bit more robust than structural factors might suggest by themselves. in looking at the identity debates in India, and I will say a little bit more about this in a minute, but in terms of my finding, what seems to be happening is that the groups that I call sort of soft and hard nationalists seem to have the upper hand in relations with the U.S., and they seem to dominate when it comes to discourse on the United States over what I have called slightly more pragmatic groups that I call great power realists and liberal globalists. So that is one reason why I find the U.S. relationship with India more vulnerable. Conversely, when you look at India's relations with China, the liberal globalists and a more centrist, sort of what I call standard nationalists, which sort of describes the governing coalitions for the last decade. The liberal globalists and the standard nationalists seem to hold the center of gravity in India's relations with China, making it more stable. The nationalists don't come in as much on this. So, and a final point in terms of looking out into the future is that a certain logic of economic integration I think is becoming more ingrained in India's own national identity. And that kind of reinforces the link to China's parallel worldview. I mean, if you think about Deng Xiaoping, 78, in many ways, China took on a kind of an economic identity as part of a strategic asset. And I think India, too, is beginning to see that, and that, I think, reinforces the good interdependence kind of cycle that one might put forth. Okay, well, I think I've got like 5 minutes left after I finish the, give the conclusion.
No, a bit more than that.
A bit more than that, okay.
About 8.
Okay. All right. Well, as I said, I chose the rebalance and Indian response and the response to the trade deficit. Let me say a few words about that. What is really striking in many ways is the fact that the rebalance, where the U.S. went out of its way to give India a central position. In fact, Defense Secretary Leon Panetta, when he made his Asia tour, called India the linchpin. He used that word, linchpin of the strategy of the rebalance. And moreover, he stated that I believe our relationship can and become more strategic, more practical, and more collaborative. Basically, they were saying, the U.S. was encouraging India in whatever way it could. And so, at the same time, when you look at India from a geostrategic position, there were quite a few voices from that sort of realist framework suggesting that India was becoming increasingly a target for Chinese assertiveness, particularly in the neighborhood. So in 2011, there was a national security annual review that came out that said that China is being much more assertive vis-a-vis the countries on its periphery, and that said India has been one of the targets in this respect. So there was certainly concern that was building up about that, all right? And so, in fact, the media, there's quite a lot of talk about the Chinese string of pearls encircling India and so forth. And so, in many ways, that time period, the 2011-2012, should have elicited a much more hard-nosed approach to China and much more receptive approach to the U.S. But it didn't happen. So that's when in the paper, I go through and show how, up and down the Indian government, across Indian analysts, you got a pushback. In fact, the defense minister came out and almost snubbed the idea of linchpin. Mm-hmm. And the director general of the institute where Panetta delivered the talk basically came out soon after, wrote a short commentary, said, we're not, I know that we know that the U.S. is a partner and so forth, but we're not. We want a multilateral approach in the area, and so forth. So, and in fact, what you found is that the realist proponents were kind of isolated in the public discourse. Okay, so, all right. Let me turn to the second case quickly, which is the trade deficit with China, which started, well, trade, to put it into context, of course, as we know, the trade took off with India in a stunning fashion. But until 1978, there was no trade. There was no real economic relations since 1962 war. So it really, so it's all the more stunning that the way it took off. But almost as stunning was the trade deficit. So that when the trade took off after the early 2000s, by 2008, it had reached a very troubling level from the Indian side. And so, you know, there were ways that they were thinking about how to overcome this, and we talked a little bit about this morning. I think John mentioned and several others talked about maybe China investing in India as a way of making a capital movement that way. But of course, there's a problem there that we might see, and that is that, you know, that means direct foreign direct investment in certain areas, and also having a large Chinese presence and so forth. That is going to have to be negotiated very carefully because of security reasons that still that are still there, and the mistrust between India and China. What about a free trade agreement that China wants with India? Well, again, most of the analysts that have looked at it said that the relative gains would go disproportionately to China. And so that probably is not going to make the trade deficit get any better. So how has India responded to this adverse economic trend toward China? And what I find is at most a mixed picture. And in fact, the government and large sections of the strategic and definitely the business elite feel that what you need to do is to not do anything drastic, all right, to try to manage these relationships. And overall, that you get the sense that China is seen as an economic opportunity, despite the pressures from the trade deficit, and that India cannot afford not to be part of that. In fact, of course, some have said that, you know, the trade deficit, this is now giving rise to a debate in India which says, well, you know, it's not China that's the problem, it's India. We don't have a manufacturing base that's good enough. And therefore, that's what we need to focus on. There's no point in blaming China for that. Others have said, China is subsidizing the Indian consumer. So, take advantage of it. And also that at this point in India's industrialization, cheap Chinese inputs are absolutely critical, so that kind of supply chain that we were talking about earlier today could become even more important along the way. And so I think, you get it's surprising in some sense. I expected to find a lot more concern about the trade deficit. And I looked at parliamentary debates, and you find the government, when these issues do come up, they keep saying things like China is a strategic partner. We have relationships with them in the G20 and BRIC and this and that, and that we have to work together. It's a neighbor, we have to work together with them. So there's a shift in that, I think, and the nationalists cannot seem to hold the ground when it comes to China. There seems to be other compelling arguments against that. All right, so I'm not going to, I think I will simply again end with my point that nationalism and identity seems to play a much bigger role as an obstacle in Indo-US relations, and it really doesn't play the same role with China, and in fact, there might be a convergence at some broad principle levels that seem to still be very important for the Indian foreign policy making elite.
Okay,
Okay?
great. You're 1 minute under.
Okay,
So,
somebody else can, you
yeah.
can have it. Howard?
Thank you very much.
All right, go for it.
Well, thank you. Let me tell you what we're going to do. I'll start talking very briefly about the bad old days, the period in India-U.S. relations before the end of the Cold War. And then Tazy will take over from me and talk about the situation as it's developed. Since then, if there's time, she's going to kick the ball back to me. I want to talk about these bad old days because the past is prologue, and I don't think that all those years can be altogether shrugged off. Let's look at what the main elements were in governing U.S. policy towards India during the Cold War. And the Cold War was just becoming the central feature of international affairs as India was becoming independent in 1947. The first element is the difference on the part of the two countries in their approach to the Cold War. The U.S., of course, followed a policy of containment. India followed a policy of non-alignment, which was interlarded by anti-racism and anti-colonialism. Our containment policy led the United States to enlist Pakistan in the Western Alliance system. And that, over the years, and still enormously complicated the U.S. relationship with India. Containment, I think, was also the driving force in leading us to finance what became substantial economic development programs in India and to laud Indian democracy. We frequently talked about Indian democracy, but I think it was never, as some proponents claimed, a significant driving force in the relationship between us and India. A second main element was the relative unimportance of India to the United States. The focus of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. foreign concerns in those years was Europe and East Asia, and not India and not the rest of South Asia. We gave India a special place because of the nuclear issue, following the peaceful nuclear explosion of the 70s. That died down, and then after the end of the Cold War period, it became important again in the 90s, in the period culminating with the Indian test of 1998. A final element throughout the Cold War period was the thinness of the relationship. There was very little trade or investment. There was limited cultural contact. The diaspora, which began in the late 1960s, hadn't come to the point, as it has now, where so many Indian Americans are playing an important part in public life and seeking, sometimes successfully, to influence U.S. policy towards India. And another point I think it'd be fair to point out is that the leaders of the two countries, for much of this period, didn't know much about one another, and what they knew about one another, they didn't much like. So I'll turn over now to Tazy.
So the end of the Cold War set the stage for transforming U.S.-India relations. It took about a decade after the Soviet collapse for this change to be internalized, especially in the Indian government, but I at least date the big transformation from the epic visit to India by President Clinton in 2000. In the background of this transformation was the change in the diaspora. Between 2000 and 2010, the Indian diaspora in the U.S. grew by 69%, and their average income reached almost double the U.S. average. Perhaps most importantly, Indian Americans dominated the information technology industry, with the two countries' industries joined at the hip. This affected both the politics and the economics of U.S. policy. The key policy drivers on the U.S. side in this policy shift were the shift in overall focus toward Asia, including South Asia, and Indian economic growth. How do I measure the shift in policy emphasis towards Asia? On the military side, the U.S. Navy's maritime strategy, released in 2007, singled out the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean as the region where U.S. naval assets would be, in their words, continuously postured. There's also a document out of the Naval War College which says we still have a two-ocean strategy, but the two oceans are the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. This is a considerable shift. U.S. trade with Asia has been among the most dynamic in the world during this time. Mr. Nee said that China is now the second largest trading partner of the United States. Japan is the fourth. India has grown to be the 10th. This is up from the 19th only about 10 years ago. So India is a much smaller player, but it's been a rapidly rising one. And if you include services trade, the figures are hard to get. They're harder to get if you want to get the whole world. Then the Indian footprint is much larger. And public opinion. A series of polls carried out by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs shows, among other things, that 2006, 43% of Americans believed that Asia was more important than Europe. 2002, that number had been 27%. So there was a public resonance to all of this. During the same period, India's economic and strategic engagement with its neighbors to the east was growing. It has free trade areas with Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia. Its trade has not actually increased that much in percentage terms with these countries, but other measures of economic engagement it has. It has a regular security dialogue with the ASEAN countries and a more cautious one with China. Indian businesses are starting to make their presence felt in Southeast Asia. There is substance behind this phrase of look east policy. While all this was happening, U.S. and Indian interests grew much better aligned than they had been in the past, and especially in Asia. I'm not a theoretician, but my view of the kind of structure of foreign policy is that ultimately it is interests that push countries together, with lots of variations of how successful this pushing together is. Neither the U.S. nor India wants to have a hostile relationship with China. Neither one wants China to become the only dominant power in East and Southeast Asia. Both are concerned about freedom of navigation. During 3 years of fairly active bilateral dialogue on East Asia, the two countries found little to disagree about. This is a big change from the bad old days that Howie was talking about. This is also the backdrop for the Obama administration's rebalancing of U.S. policy and strategic assets towards Asia. Deepa talked about the rather tepid Indian reception to this idea. I look at it a little bit differently. I don't disagree with anything she said about what the Indian official statements were that responded to it. But the fact that the U.S. was making policy toward a version of Asia that extended certainly as far west as India was a significant change, and one that was basically, I think, welcomed in Delhi, although perhaps not so much publicly as privately. It linked India to the larger U.S. policy and strategic thinking. We had also arrived at a point where more often than not, Indian and U.S. policies towards the Indian Ocean, towards the larger Asian security picture, were working in parallel. They were never officially coordinated, They aren't now, and they aren't going to be anytime soon. But the expectation is that they will work more or less in sympathy rather than at cross purposes. And by that measure, I think this policy change was a success in terms of U.S.-India relations. Coming to the economic factors behind the big transformation. In the 1990s and 2000s, India opened its economy much more to the private sector and to external trade and investment. Private investment, private capital formation in 2010 was 24% of GDP, up from 17% 10 years earlier. This compares with a stagnant roughly 7.8% for public sector investment. That means that the private sector was a bigger chunk of the Indian economy. And as for external trade, it's even more astonishing. The traditional figure had been something, the foreign trade to GDP had been something on the order of 13%. By 2010, it was well over half. In the same range as a lot of other countries, and of course John pointed out that it is now top China, at least for the time being. India had become one of the fastest growing economies of the world. Business connections determine how seriously Washington takes a country far more than most people realize. This isn't a policy variable. It's not something the U.S. can decide. But it simply means that with India representing a significant share of U.S. trade and one of the fastest growing countries in the world, what happens there is going to matter more to Washington. And in that sense, I would say that trade policy and strategic policy are still quite distinct, but the overall weight of trade is going to either emphasize or de-emphasize the importance of the strategic side. The culmination of all of this was the Civil Nuclear Agreement signed in 2008 and supplemented by agreement under the Obama administration on the thorny issue of an Indian reprocessing facility. The negotiations leading up to this agreement were a remarkable experience, which I can talk about on another occasion so as not to eat up too much time now. This was intended to demonstrate U.S. willingness to make a major strategic policy change that included legislative change, and one of the holy grails of American diplomacy is you never want to have to promise John legislative changes. We did that. We did that for India. It was very controversial in India. It nearly failed basically because of the opposition of the Indian nuclear establishment and of the left parties, and implementation is in trouble. So in a sense, this is almost an even better metaphor for what Deepa was talking about than the example she gave. But you knew there had to be a but. There are limitations to this undeniably very positive record. For old-timers like us, this couldn't have been imagined when we were still in the saddle. But we still have a high-maintenance relationship with India. And if you want a recent example, the arrest of the Deputy Consul General in New York certainly provides it. What are some of the key limitations? I start with the two countries' global vision and self-concept, and Deepa, yes, this is awfully close to your identity gap issue. The U.S. concept of what we are in the world always starts with leader. In India, the key concept is strategic autonomy, and it does not include the word follower. We haven't quite figured out how to make these things mesh. We can usually talk our way around it. India is not comfortable responding to others' leadership. The U.S. is not accustomed to partners with such a prickly view of what their sovereignty demands. In a sense, the closest analogy is France, and it's an imperfect analogy. Second point, limitation. Economic ties are increasingly large and important, but we have different expectations. For the U.S., the Holy Grail is trade access and a friendly environment for investors. For India, the Holy Grail is movement of persons, access to high technology, particularly in the defense area. We've actually done much better on the high-tech issue. We have not done particularly well on the movement of persons issue. And we are still dealing with the fact that for the U.S., when you have more trade, you will also, almost by definition, have more trade problems. more trade disputes in the WTO and so on. And that is happening. Are we interdependent? I would say bilaterally, not much, except perhaps for the IT industry, and that is an area that moves almost independent of U.S. policy, except unfortunately for U.S. immigration policy. But India certainly has become more interdependent with the rest of the world. Third aspect of the limitations, it's opportunities and limitations, regional ties. We have a chronic disconnect on Iran. Our relations in the Indian Ocean and Asia are a good news story. We face a tension that's been referred to in the China context. India's preference for free riding, U.S. desire to share some of the burdens as well as the benefits of global leadership. The area where we have the greatest disagreements is multilateral. India is, at least in theory, very pro-multilateral. It actually doesn't really like multilateral instruments that constrain it. If this sounds familiar to those of you who follow American politics, guess what? This is something we share, though we don't like to talk about that. In practice, for India, multilateral issues are those where its interests and its operating style push towards solidarity with the developing world. Interestingly enough, when we visited China a couple of years ago, what we heard constantly from both Indian and Chinese observers of that relationship was that the multilateral was their best arena, the regional was the worst, and the bilateral was not too great. With us, the regional was probably the top, with the bilateral close behind, and the multilateral, and I would say the worst is WTO, bringing up the rear. Let me turn the floor back to Howie for some concluding thoughts.
How much time do we have?
4 minutes.
Good. Just a word in conclusion about the upcoming Indian election and how that might impact on the way the United States deals with and views India. We don't know that much about Mr. Modi's foreign policy ideas, and they may not be fully articulated by him to this point. We have already, the United States has already met the first challenge presented to us by Modi's rise to prominence and the good likelihood that he'll become India's next prime minister. And that was the establishment of high-level contact. The U.S. ambassador in New Delhi had been instructed for years not to have any truck with Mr. Modi, whose visitor's visa to the United States had been revoked in 2005 because of his role, or his alleged role, in the pogroms in his state of Gujarat. The Department of State, after wringing its hands for some time and finding strong opposition to the idea from the people who deal with human rights in the department, finally did agree, and Ambassador Powell strongly supported this, to allow her to go to Ahmedabad and meet Mr. Modi, and that contact, by all accounts, went very well. The United States is surely going to welcome the emphasis that we understand Modi is likely to give to economics, economic development in his administration. What if Modi isn't elected? What if there's a third front of smaller parties dependent on one of the two big parties for remaining in power? A weak coalition would be hard for the United States to deal with. And I think one important reason for that is that we're impatient. We like decisions. And that kind of weak coalition is unlikely to be able to reach these quick decisions that we found. Finally, and more generally, is the issue of democracy. Democracy surely brings us together philosophically, and we value it. But in actual working with another government, democracy is sometimes